The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. The leaders scoffed at Jesus, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked Jesus, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The Gospel of the Lord. Came across this story of a priest who was giving a homily, and as he went on, he became more and more animated. He made sweeping gestures and accidentally knocked his papers from the pulpit. He scrambled to pick them up, then asked, Now, where was I?" And a voice from the congregation responded, "Right near the end." Well, we're just at the beginning, so we know that's no. But we are at an end. We're at the end of our liturgical year. And as we conclude our liturgical year every year with the last Sunday of Ordinary Time, we honor Christ the King. And very much as we celebrate this solemnity, we see, a king in a different view. And some of that is sort of connected in some respects to that first reading. When the tribes came to David, what did they say? "We are your bone and your flesh." What they were saying is, we belong to you and you belong to us. We are of one. It's based on relationship. And I think that's very important, and that's one of the things that I know I carry within my priesthood and my understanding of church. Relationship is so important. Relationship with Jesus, relationship with one another, relationship within the church. Very much, that's the kind of king we have. One who wants to be in relationship with us. Not one that just sits on some throne somewhere and you can't access him in any kind of way, or you need special permission to have an audience with him. But we have a king who, as we know, is God, who could have stayed as God totally. But no, he came down and shared our very flesh. He shared our wounds, and he even shared in death. Which as God, he wouldn't have had to do any of those things. But he wanted to be so connected, so in relationship with us, that he chose to do that. And we'll be celebrating how that all happened very soon when we celebrate the Incarnation at Christmas. But that's the kind of king we have. Not one on some distant throne, one who actually became one of us in all things but sin. And it's interesting, too, when we hear this scene in the gospel. At a moment when Jesus looks least like a king, being tortured and hanging on a cross, that's when he acts most like a king. It's interesting, St. John Chrysostom once said, "Jesus opened paradise not by lifting a sword, but by stretching out his hands." A king who came not to be served, but to serve. And that's the kind of king we belong to. One whose power is mercy, whose strength is forgiveness, whose victory is love. Which is very different than our typical understanding of a king. And that brings us perhaps to where we are today, when we look at our world, our culture, and our own daily lives. What is king in our lives? If we look at our culture and we look at our time today, we have a lot of competing kings around us. Fear wants to be the king of some of us. Anger for some others. Comfort wants to be king for others. Politics wants to be king. Cynicism wants to be king. And there are many rulers out there shouting for our loyalty. All of these kinds of things that are drawing us in, or trying to draw us in. And that's where on a feast day like today, we're being challenged to look at our lives and say, which king am I serving? Am I serving any of those kinds of kings? Or am I truly following the King whom we celebrate today, the King of the universe? And as we reflect on that, I think we also have to take that other step, as I said, looking at our culture, looking at our lives, because if all we do is celebrate Christ the King in the church, well, then we're missing something, a big something. It's easy to celebrate Christ the King here in this worship space. But we have to recognize that if we really are followers of that King, it's another thing to live like that at home, at work, in our relationships, and in our moments of weakness. If Christ is truly our King and not those other things, then his way is what we follow. We partake in his patience, his mercy, his courage, his truth. Those are the things that should be shaping our lives. Those are the things that should be reflected in our words and in our actions if we truly are following Jesus as the King. And that's not easy, or at least I know I don't find that easy. There are times in my journey I have doubts, I have questions. I get tempted to be lured down one of those other king ways. And that's when sometimes we're like that other thief on the cross saying, hey, save yourself and save us, mocking him. When in reality, we have to be like that good thief that recognized in humility he didn't have everything all figured out. He had gone down the wrong path. He didn't have perfect faith, but he was still turning to Jesus with a fragile, humble prayer. And that was enough. That was enough. Maybe we need to keep that in mind for our journey too. When we do stray and perhaps follow other kings in our lives, all we need to do is turn back to Jesus and humbly say, remember me. And Jesus says, yes, I want you to be part of my kingdom. When we think about the kingdom of God, I came across a little reflection explanation that I thought puts it in a little bit of a different context. Identifying the kingdom in three different ways. The kingdom of God is a space. It exists in every home where parents and children love each other. It exists in every region and country that cares for its most weak and most vulnerable. It exists in every parish that reaches out to the needy. The kingdom of God is a time. It happens whenever someone feeds a hungry person, shelters a homeless person, shows care to a neglected person. It happens whenever we overturn an unjust law, or correct an injustice, or avert a war. It happens whenever people join in the struggle to overcome poverty, to erase ignorance, to pass on the faith. The kingdom of God is a condition, and its symptoms are love, justice, and peace. So when we think of the kingdom in those three ways, as a space, as a time, and as a condition, how is that reflected in your life? How is it reflected in mine? And that's where, as we come to this last Sunday in ordinary time, next Sunday will be the first Sunday of Advent, which that means it's the beginning of a new liturgical year. And so we've come to the end of the year to begin a new year. And as we do even from a civil perspective, and January 1st, what do? Many of us create or look at our lives and say, okay, what resolutions are we going to come up with? And maybe that's where we're at this point in our spiritual year, our liturgical year. We've come to the end. Maybe we need to take that step back and see, where are we? Have we let Christ rule our decisions? Have we let him rule our priorities? Have we let him rule our wounds, our grudges, and our fears? You know, today, this feast that we're celebrating isn't simply admiring Christ's kingship. It's about choosing it. It's about asking ourselves, where in my life do I resist Jesus as my king, and where do I embrace him as my king? What part of my heart is still holding on to worldly, kingly things, and what part of my heart is opening up to receive Jesus as my king? And hopefully as we journey, we'll keep opening our hearts more and allowing him more into our lives. And that's the thing with Jesus. He's patient. He waits for us, eagerly anticipating when we will reach out to him. Because he's not a king that rules by force. He doesn't come and say, I'm imposing my kingship on you. No, he rules by invitation. He invites us into his life. He invites us to actually share in his kingship. If we listen to the ritual that we celebrate for baptism, some of the words, we get baptized into Jesus as priest, prophet, and king. So we, through baptism, share in those three aspects of Jesus as priest, prophet, and king, the king that we celebrate today. So as I said, we're coming to the end of a year, beginning of a new one. Maybe we need to see, what new fresh start do we need to be looking at? How can the year coming up look different than the year behind us? And do we have to do anything extreme? Well, maybe some of our lives we might have to do something extreme, but I'm saying no, because Jesus doesn't expect the extreme from us. Look at that thief, the good one, on the hill in Calvary. Simple words, Jesus, remember me. That was enough for Jesus to say, today you will be with me in paradise. That doesn't sound huge to me. Maybe that's what we get caught up in sometimes. We think it's so big that we have to commit our lives to the Lord that, we can't do it. And Jesus says, no, just start out small. Start out by saying, Jesus, remember me. In our own words, in our own way. Doesn't have to be a polished prayer. Doesn't have to be a perfect prayer. Just cry out in humility, sincerity, and true desire for Jesus as your king, as my king. And just say, Jesus, remember me. Jesus, help me. I want you to be my king. I want to share in your kingship. That's all he's asking. And if we merely do that, even just a little, he can take that and do much. He will meet us in our weakness. He will lead us into his kingdom and make our lives reflect the one who reigns from the cross. Christ is King. May he reign not just in the world, not just in the church, but in you and in me, right here, right now, in the new year of grace that we are about to begin.